We're wrapping up our NES coverage with Shatterhand from Jaleco. The article has a rundown of the formulas for the various weapons in the game, with the letter power-ups you pick up, and maps of each level of the game through Area E. Shatterhand is structured a little like Mega Man X, in the sense that you have a opening level which introduces you to most of the game mechanics, and then you have 5 levels after that you can do in any order before the final boss level becomes available. Unlike Mega Man X, though, the gameplay is closer to Ninja Gaiden. You go through the levels in the fashion of a platformer and engage enemies in melee combat. Getting any combination of 3 alpha or beta characters will get you a sub-weapon, which will stay with you until the launcher for that sub-weapon takes enough damage that it's destroyed, or at the end of the level, whichever comes first. The controls are excellent, and while I'd like a little further range with each melee attack, it does enough damage, and the weapons, as far as the special weapons, are very useful in most situations. Some are more useful for certain levels than others, naturally. The enemies are also designed well enough that I was able to make the weapons, both sub-weapons and the main melee attack, work for me fairly well. Bosses are also fairly nicely designed. This game definitely is a sort of hidden gem, and definitely worth picking up if you can find a copy. Moving on to Game Boy titles, we have Castlevania II, Belmont's Revenge. I've apparently never covered the first Game Boy Castlevania game, so I'll have to remember to cover it in my next Best of the Rest roundup. The guide itself gives a rundown of the weapons and power-ups in the game, along with maps of the 4 main castles in the first half of Dracula's Castle. Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge is actually a fairly decent adaptation of the NES series for the Game Boy. The controls are comparable to the NES version, though the game eschews stairs in favor of vertical ropes, probably due to situations with how many screens high you can be, and screen scrolling and that sort of thing. Though the game does incorporate the ropes fairly well into the game's level design. They recognized their limitations, came up with a fix, and really used that fix and owned it. That said, the game is not without its flaws. The NES version did do a good job of prioritizing whip power-ups in candles, so if you died, the first few candles you got were generally going to be whip power-ups to get you back up to speed, no matter what was in those candles before. Here, this isn't really the case. This is a shame, because otherwise it's a pretty decent game. I even like the fact that you can pick which of the 4 castles you take in what order, again, to bring up the Mega Man comparisons from Shatterhand, a lot like Mega Man. I mean, this is a pretty decent game, and I actually call it an underrated gem for the Game Boy. It's not flawless, it's not a must-own by any means, but it's certainly worth giving a shot, particularly if you're a fan of the Castlevania franchise. Next is another Simpsons game for the Game Boy this time, with Bart Simpson, Escape from Camp Deadly. Bart and Lisa are trying to do a Great Escape-style escape from a summer camp, run presumably by a relative of Mr. Burns. The article gives a map of the game's first level and notes on how to do some of the following levels. Well, to damn this game with faint praise, this is probably the best Simpsons game I've played for the show thus far. Not the best Simpsons games I've played, because I've played the Xbox 360 version of The Simpsons Arcade, but the best I've played for this show. Still, it's not a great game. The levels have some significant problems with their structure and how the enemies respond to your weapons. That said, the game manages to balance the platforming on the screen with the size of the sprites fairly well. There are still a few leaps of faith that you have to make. That said, is this game worth picking up? No, not really. Maybe if you want to own every Simpsons game, but it's certainly not as bad as the games that came before, as far as Simpsons games, but I can't give this a recommendation. Next up is Track Meet, a track and field game for the Game Boy with some tongue-in-cheek characters, one of whom is kinda racist. This is a collection of mini-games focused entirely around button mashing the A and B buttons, and this would honestly actually work better with a controller. I mean, man, at least Konami's Track and Field actually used the D-pad. This one doesn't even do that. Wrapping up our Game Boy games, we have a Game Boy port of Monopoly. This is a very direct port of the NES version of Monopoly, with some minor differences that, because this game was designed for a monochrome system, basically you have a lack of color. You don't have the colors of the properties on the board. It doesn't really also render on display on screen where houses are if people build houses. So if you're trying to figure out in advance what roll you need or want to hope for to avoid landing on a house, you don't really have that. You just have to kind of remember where all the houses are. That sort of thing. In the Game Boy Classified Information column, we have a drawing mini-game in R-Type for the Game Boy. Nothing fancy, it's just basically drawing dots on screen to make lines. That sort of thing. We then have a NES Q&A article with some basic questions about the NES, covering stuff like the price point, launch date, and whether NES games will still be manufactured. In short, we're going to have a few more years of NES games, so we'll still be covering that system for a while yet. In the SNES preview column, we have looks at Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Howl's Hole-in-One Golf, and R-Type. In the Now Playing column, we have coverage of the NES port of Sid Meier's Pirates, along with 2 Super Nintendo titles in the also-rans, Super Bases Loaded and Pilot Wings. Maybe those will get covered in a future issue. They probably will. In the top 30, Ultima 3 has re-entered the list, alongside The Uninvited. Again, just in time for October. We also have newcomers with Base Wars and Kings of the Beach. In our celeb profile, we have a actual real live human, as opposed to a cartoon character, with Joe Regal Buto, who at this time is appearing on Murphy Brown. Since Murphy Brown has rapped, he has done a fair amount of directing work on television, along with some TV acting as well. And to wrap up the issue, in Pack Watch, we have a NES port of Ultima 5 Warriors of Destiny, which I think might actually be better served on the SNES, but that's just me. Additionally, the G.I. Joe license has shifted to Capcom, and they're putting out a new G.I. Joe game, which appears to take some structural cues from Bionic Commando. We also have announcements of upcoming releases of UN Squadron and Populous for the Super Nintendo. As with the last issue, let's get the easy choice out of the way. F-Zero is a definite must-play for the Super Nintendo. Other than that, I'd recommend picking up Shatterhand for the NES. It's definitely a hidden highlight of the NES's library, and certainly worth your time and attention. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show and would like to toss me a few bucks, you should perhaps consider backing my Patreon. For $1 or $2 a month, you can help me improve the show. For $5 a month, you can get your name in the credits. And for even more, you can request episodes for my other series, Breaking It All Down reviews. Alternatively, if you'd rather not do the whole recurring financial thing, I have a tip jar as well, which you should be able to see on my YouTube page. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.